This idea of I have all the answers to the questions in the world and I tell my people what to do is no longer relevant. Almost given all the geopolitical changes and the technology disruptions, I as a leader cannot have all the answers to the questions. Therefore, I do need to have a purpose, a vision, a sense of direction. I need to be able to provide that to the team or the institution I'm leading. So you cannot delegate that task. But yet, I need to be humble enough. I need to be able to listen and I need to be able to co-create solutions, experiments, test them out, and then use the evidence, use the input from various people, customers, teams, etc., to then figure out how to solve these important and ever-changing problems.
Ramesh, I'm so excited to have you. Every time I chat, I feel like I walk away feeling smarter and inspired. So thanks for joining.
Thanks for inviting me. And Vince, I'll say the same thing right back at you. Each time I walk away charged up, energized. So very excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm going to dive straight in. Of course, you've come out this book, Journey of Leadership. It's really creating deep conversation with different leaders across organizations everywhere. I guess I want to first start by asking you, why did you decide to write a book about leadership?
I've had this idea, Vince, for a long time. I've considered myself a student of leadership in the 30 plus years that I've been at McKinsey, both supporting and studying leaders within McKinsey. And then, of course, clients and through the Bauer Forum, lots and lots of leaders. And one of the roles I play at McKinsey is the dean of our Bauer Forum, which is McKinsey's CEO learning program. We reached a stage where we realized we would have more than 500 CEOs who've gone through the Bauer Forum. Now that number is actually more than 600. And we felt like we have a data set from which we can draw from. And our intention behind the book was to bring the stories, the micro practices of these leaders, and to some extent democratize the Bauer Forum for the world. And we thought a book would be a great way to do that. And that's really the reason we wrote the book and we're bringing the ideas to the world a bit.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, the wealth of wisdom that you are sort of generating across the conversations in that forum, the sort of difficulty of challenges that these CEOs are solving, I mean, that must be incredibly rich. I read through the book, and of course, the core concept is to lead inside out. I think is a really interesting kind of visceral way to frame what leadership should look like. I'd love to hear how you define it and why it's so critical today to think about leading from the inside out.
We thought of this book more than 3 years ago, and we've taken a while to write it and then launch the book. But the more I think about it, the concept of inside out leadership is even more relevant and important today than it was even 3 years ago. And the reason I say that is the geopolitics, the technology, AI, climate change, these are all like huge disruptions in the world. And what we observe these leaders, the CEOs who came through the Bauer Forum, the other leaders we work with, the only way to deal with this situation is by having a clear sense of what is my purpose? Who am I? What are crucible moments that have shaped my life? And use that sense of purpose to inspire teams and inspire change in the world. So this idea of I have all the answers to the questions in the world and I tell my people what to do is no longer relevant. Almost given all the geopolitical changes and the technology disruptions, I as a leader cannot have all the answers to the questions. So therefore, I do need to have a purpose, a vision, a sense of direction. I need to be able to provide that to the team or the institution I'm leading. So you cannot delegate that task. But yet, I need to be humble enough. I need to be able to listen and I need to be able to co-create solutions, experiments, test them out, and then use the evidence, use the input from various people, customers, teams, etc., to then figure out how to solve these important and ever-changing problems. So this is the concept of human-centric, purpose-driven leadership that we are trying to bring out through this book, Vince.
Do you think that it's so important for leaders to lead inside out with sort of starting from yourself because that's how you create followership and inspire others? Or like, what's the reason why it's actually so important that you need to start with yourself? Because some might say, like theoretically, right? Just listen to the market, listen to what your people need, and like tailor your style to just like fit that. Some might say that instead of like start with yourself, right? So I'm curious, like why you think actually you got to start with yourself here.
No, it's a great question. So, and I wouldn't say it's an either or, right? So, and often in the book, we talk about managing polarities, that sometimes things that might seem apparent contradictions, the challenge for leadership is how do you do a bit of both? So to me, it's more of an and. But the reason I need to have a sense of my own purpose and who I am and what gives me energy is so that I can be authentic. I can stay true to that. And in a world that is changing so much, use that sense of purpose to bring a little more calmness, little more long term orientation to what I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to lead a team or an institution. And yet, you're absolutely right. As I navigate that, I need to be able to listen to what the market is saying. I need to be able to listen to the customers. One of the ideas we talk about in the book is this concept of truth telling, where a media company CEO, he realized as he became CEO that people stopped telling him the truth. So he did have a sense of purpose and a clear vision, but he also needed to understand how the customers were reacting to the product launches and how the front line was truly feeling. And without that, he was not able to guide and direct the organization. So you absolutely have to be dynamic. You have to be able to pivot, but do that from a place of authenticity and a sense of purpose. So that's why I would say it's a bit of an and wins to the dichotomy you're describing versus an either or.
And I mean, as you describe it, it definitely resonates to me. Of course, like I'm running a very small company, but definitely think about how do I create buy-in and followership from our team as a startup that has to navigate so many different twists and turns and get to like the stage where we're at, where we're kind of excited to be growing and sort of hitting our stride. Is I think on one hand, I think people need to be able to describe who I am as a leader, like actually have a sense for like, I know who Vince is and like he is like what he describes himself to be. And at the same time, like the strategy might constantly change, right? But the core values are consistent. And the way that I show up to the organization is sort of consistent, or at least I try anyway.
No, you do, Vince, and I've known you for a long time, not just in your startup, but also at McKinsey. I think that there are things that you represent and things that you do and things that you believe in around learning constantly, asking for feedback, sharing feedback, helping other leaders grow, and also helping leaders unleash their full sense of purpose to bring a positive change in the world. And I think those attributes of who you are and what you do don't change. And at the cost of embarrassing you, my sense is they have not changed, whether you are at McKinsey, whether you are at Sparkwise, or whatever else you do with your friends, with your family, and who you are. And yet you have to solve problems in different contexts. And I'm sure you're coming up with new ideas, experiments, testing, and I learn each time you come up with an idea. Some of those are maybe a bit crazy too, but that's what makes you special and inspiring. And you're able to get the feedback and pivot as needed, which is what I think is needed for leaders today.
Well, thank you for those words. And of course, I wouldn't be here without the mentorship of you and other sort of McKinsey leaders who really took me when I was a new grad from college and sort of helped me become the professional I am today. Maybe diving into the book a little bit, what would you say are 2 to 3 surprising insights that you ran into as you wrote the book?
Yeah, as we dug into this concept of human centric, purpose driven, inside out leadership, we began to disaggregate what are some of the underlying behaviors. So we came with a set of 6 behaviors on leading from the inside, and then 6 behaviors on leading from the outside, and then how do you continue the journey and keep renewing yourself as a leader. So that's how the book is structured. I think a few surprising insights. I think one is just the importance of vulnerability, and how do you express vulnerability in the business context in a world which is changing so fast. As a leader, I cannot go out and say, hey, I have no clue about what is happening, and yet I need to be able to go to my clients or partners or my own employees and be able to say, these are the questions where we don't have the answers, I don't have the answers, and let's actually construct these answers together, right? One example we have in the book is Rita Roy, who's the CEO of MasterCard Foundation. On the one hand, Rita has set a very bold vision to create 30 million jobs in Africa, and she leads with courage and high integrity, very clear values. And yet, with her teams, with her partners, creating 30 million jobs, especially, 70% of that for women in Africa is not an easy problem in agriculture, in the digital field, in healthcare, many, many sectors. So she is able to then frame that and co create solutions with their NGO partners, with their teams, with other people in the ecosystem that she works with, and do that from a spirit of humility and respect and co-creation. These are all core values for them. So this whole idea of vulnerability and how do you express vulnerability with courage and boldness was a learning, was a surprise for me. We already talked about truth telling a little bit earlier, the importance of obligation to dissent. You may remember that from your time at McKinsey as well, like the importance of building that as a muscle in an institution, asking and receiving feedback. Again, it's an idea we had known, but just the importance of that and how do you speak truth to power as a core element of human centric purpose driven leadership, that really came home and was reinforced to us. And then maybe the last idea I'll talk about is renewal. That's why we called it the journey of leadership. I think we realized that it's a journey, never ends, and all these CEOs, the leaders we saw in the Bauer Forum, they realize that they need to keep learning and evolving to stay relevant, to drive, lead their institutions in the world. And what are different ways of learning? Mahatma Gandhi once said, live every day like it's your last and learn every day like you live forever. So that was another idea. Just the importance of that and how these leaders practice that was a surprise and a learning for us, Vince.
Yeah, as you're talking through, those are definitely some of the insights and sort of characteristics of leadership that have struck me most as I read through it. And I think the way I interpret it was a lot of the attributes really that were highlighted in the book ultimately all contributed to this idea of like unlocking collective intelligence and also creating thickness of communication and trust in an organization such that you really operate strongly as a collective. And all the elements were around like how do leaders create that environment. You've had these attributes show up through the Bauer Forum and actually having a lot of active conversation with CEOs. Are the cultures of organization where these are being practiced a lot pretty similar, or do they actually play out in very different ways? They actually operate in very different cultural environments, but some of these like attributes can still be integrated.
That's a great question. Firstly, I love this label of collective intelligence. We don't use that in the book, but I love that. And if you're okay, I might copy that and talk about it as well. It's a great idea. And I think it's something that then holds the diversity, can be inclusive, but also create a little bit of a, like you said, a buffer or a strength that can help both individuals, but also institutions become more resilient. Another theme that we touch on the book. So I love that idea. On the question of cultures, we absolutely saw different cultures that these institutions were practicing, even though they were human centric. And I think part of that goes back to our work on organizational health and different archetypes. You've seen some of that work as well when you were at McKinsey. There are some organizations that are really focused on executing really well and understanding their customers, bringing people together and driving executional excellence in what they do. Others who are more like, I would call them like talent knowledge factories, a bit like what consulting or McKinsey does. Others who are like more market shapers, innovators, Apple, who are able to not just listen to their consumers but also shape what consumers expect and set a new bar for innovation. So there are different ways of how cultures get expressed, but we did see many common practices and approaches to driving this kind of culture. Once a leader, a set of leaders, a team is clear on what's the culture they want to put in place, the way to embed that is through rituals, through legends, is through stories. The leader we have in the book is Frank D'Souza, who led Cognizant, one of the leading Indian technology BPO companies. He led that for a long period of time, created enormous value for clients, for employees, for investors. And Frank always believed in these rituals. They would bring the customer's voice into the boardroom, into their leadership team consistently. He would reward people and have legends where people listened to their customers and did the right thing to delight customers. And they knew performance would always follow from that. And they had stories that they had embedded of the frontline people doing the right things. And that's what they would consistently celebrate year after year for decades to really inject that kind of customer driven executional excellence recipe into the institution. The overall strategic direction and the recipe might be different, but we saw a lot of commonalities in how to get that embedded, how to embed purpose, culture, values into the institution, Vince.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, talking about sort of the diversity in which this plays out, I'd be very curious. I know you've been traveling everywhere across the globe, engaging in conversation with leaders about the book, how it applies to their organization. Can you share maybe like 2 to 3 things that seem to really resonate with leaders and why that might be the case? Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I've been traveling a lot from Latin America to Europe to Asia and of course US as well, talking about the ideas in the book. Something I'm happy with is the notion of purpose driven, human centric, inside out leadership is resonating across cultures. It's been lovely to see that. It actually is consistent with some of the Asian ideas around leadership that have been timeless and described. It's also consistent with, even people have tracked it back to Socrates and it's lovely to see the connections with some timeless concepts. So that has been good to see and observe and study. And yet, I think many different nuances in terms of the pace of driving change and how do you engage, how do you communicate with people where you have to be quite thoughtful. You've told me the importance of change leadership as a team and how important that is that you're picking up from clients. And so, on that dimension, cultural nuances are quite important. The book has a story of Mark Fields, who was at Ford Motor Company for a long time. And at some point in his career, he was sent to Japan to help turn around Mazda. And I think Mark realized that he couldn't come in and within a few months set a new agenda and start telling people what to do. But he had to respect the Japanese culture and really spend more time listening and understanding them and giving them comfort that he knew their heritage, he was respecting their values and really deeply immersing himself into their way of doing things. And once he did that, then they were really bought into the agenda. So it was no longer Mark's strategy, but it was really more their strategy, their vision, their ideas. And once they got that, then the ownership they had and the change program went actually much faster, had huge positive impact on the performance of the company, but also unleashing the leadership potential and improving the culture of the place. Those are areas where important differences, leaders have to recognize the differences and use that to tailor their communication approach, the pacing, and how they engage with people. And if they can do that, you can actually bring about huge change in what you do in a way that is still authentic to who you are, the vision and the purpose, but bring people along in that journey. That's been beautiful to observe as I've been going around and talking to various people.
Yeah, it sounds like the core ideas are, as you said, timeless and very human. And so they resonate across geographies and cultures and so on. But the way in which then you have to implement it and bring it to life in an organization is where nuances happen. And so a lot of your conversation ends up being about, okay, well, how would you bring it to your organization? What does it take? What's the adaptation needed and stuff like that?
Exactly.
Is there any examples of those conversations where you were kind of surprised about how the leader would think about rolling out in an organization? I'm curious if you've run into any conversation where I haven't thought about it that way, but they sort of digest it in their particular way.
One of my learnings is if a leader comes from within an institution and has spent a long period of time inside the institution, then they need to figure out a way of injecting some external thinking and figuring out a way by which you can shake up the system and show the people that you're not afraid of trying new approaches, so that you can break through the organizational inertia that is very natural in a system. And similarly, if you're a leader coming in from the outside and you've taken on a new role, could be the CEO role or could be another role in the institution, back similar to my Mark Fields example, you do need to spend the time getting acceptance and understanding the culture, call it the baseline in terms of the facts, but also the current ways of working in terms of the culture, so that then, like, when you're coming up with new ideas or new ways of working, it's anchored in the current state, but you're also then pushing in what I call the proximal zone of development,
Right.
for the leader or for a system as a whole. My learning has been that if you make a system too uncomfortable, you can get rejected. But if you're, too comfortable in the system, then you run the risk of just getting overwhelmed in the inertia. So part of the challenge for leaders is figuring out, like, where do you want to be where you're making a system uncomfortable enough, but not like making it so uncomfortable that you're injecting anxiety, and that can then come in the way of sustainable change.
I really like the concept of a zone of proximal development applied to organization, and like helping leaders really think about what is that for your organization. How do you create just the right environment for change? That maybe brings me to now, the current world that we live in. There are so many different factors that are like disrupting the workplace. Of course, there's a bunch of macro stuff going on. Everywhere you go, everyone's talking about AI. Maybe the AI piece I think is in particular important. I'd love to get your thoughts, because this whole book is around human-centered leadership. And now we're getting fundamental questions about what does it even mean to be human in the workplace? And what does the workforce or the organization of the future look like? I'm curious if in your conversation about this book, you've actually had conversation also about what does it mean in a more AI forward world, and how do you like integrate these ideas together?
Yeah, we've been having lots of conversations on what does human-centric leadership mean in an AI-driven world. And by the way, even next week, I'm going to be speaking at a conference in a panel with a bunch of technology leaders on the intersection between AI and leadership. Firstly, as McKinsey, all our research shows that technology, AI, Gen AI, this is going to have huge impact on the world. I myself am a computer science engineer. I've come far away from technology, but I'm actually moving back to some of my roots to really help clients understand what they can do, how they can use technology to drive business impact. And so all of us will need to become much more aware of how we can use technology to improve what we do, deliver better results for our customers, improve productivity. There's no way we can ignore what's happening. All of us, I think, will have a co-pilot. Even there will come a day, Vince, where before you and I speak, we'll probably have our co-pilots talk to each other.
I like a lot.
And then maybe our co-pilots will be listening to us and then give us suggestions on like what we should do next, and like synthesize the 2 3 big ideas that came from this conversation, right? So I think technology will have a huge impact, no question. And yet I think the role of the human in the loop is not going away anytime soon. The importance of empathy, creativity, judgment, managing risk, ethics, all of these are going to become super important in the future. And so the question for any organization or any individual is, how do I embed technology, use technology to unleash my own purpose in the most productive way, and yet be clear on where is it that I am adding distinctive value that, no piece of technology can do. And I'm sure technology will keep evolving, but I still feel like at this point, there's so much that humans can do around the dimensions that I talked about. How do I then continue to sharpen my own skills on those dimensions and help the leaders around me and help the institutions that I'm part of become better and better at those, some people call it 21st century skills? That's the challenge I see in today's world.
Yeah. Were there any conversations about which of some of the leadership attributes you had in the book are becoming increasingly pronounced in this world? I'm curious that if sort of you ever got to that level of granularity in your conversations.
We did. And I think I've touched on some of those even in this conversation, right? Like I touched on vulnerability. Maybe another close cousin is resilience. We talk about it in the book as well. All of us go through crisis. We've been through some very tough times, and we've needed a lot of professional help, family, friends, our clients, colleagues to come out of that and really help us sharply identify what is our purpose. And the more I've thought about it, my own purpose is to bring a smile, a sense of possibility in a world that is going through such change. And McKinsey, the Bauer Forum, the book, they're all platforms to express my own purpose in the world. And so that idea of resilience is like quite important and will continue to stay important. I touched on empathy, connecting with people. That will be quite important. And then this idea of embedding purpose at scale in an institution using rituals, legends, and stories, that is important. So those are some of the dimensions that I feel even as AI comes in and helps us improve productivity, helps us deliver more value to our customers, these dimensions that kind of represent resilience, empathy, curiosity, critical thinking, innovation, those will all continue to be quite important, Vince, and are related to the 12 dimensions that we describe in the book.
As you describe it, there's like a whole like chunk that's for me that will always be important, which is how do you harness human motivation? Like we care about agency and like autonomy. And so you need some way to like harness your people's motivation towards doing things. And then also you still have to hold up bar, right? Like what does excellence look like? What does quality look like? And you have to use a judgment, I guess, to guide that. And what does ethical sort of work look like? I know that the book was initially written for a CEO audience, but very much as we discussed before, like it's the sort of lessons are relevant like across an organization. What was the reception of some of the leaders that you've spoken to about how they might think about embedding some of these things into their organization, like which types of leaders they think is particularly important for this to be taught to? I'm curious if you had that conversation.
No, we did. So, firstly, the book, we didn't write it just for the CEO audience. Of course, we wanted to build off the lessons learned from a lot of CEOs and great leaders, and we use that as a substrate. We also went back to the broader work that McKinsey has done with organizations. In fact, our publishers insisted that we do some of that, and we brought in Dana Mayor, who leads our organization practice, and to bring the lessons from our broader work with institutions. And in fact, we didn't use the word CEO in the title exactly for that reason. We called it The Journey of Leadership. And we've been working through different levels of organizations. So we've been working more with senior leaders as we launched the book and we brought this to the world. But as we are taking this more widely, we're figuring out ways of using the same ideas to help more and more leaders. Part of our intention, like I said, was to democratize the Bauer Forum and all these practices so that everybody can benefit from that. And so we've in fact described in the book a way by which anybody can construct their own quote unquote Bauer Forum with a set of peers, a set of advisors to be able to then get input and challenge each other and coach each other in the process. And I'm about to launch a course with my alma mater. I went to one of the IITs in India, and this is still in design stages, but I can share this in this forum with a professor to bring this to alumni from my institute. So there are ways in which we want to bring this to many, many audiences. And I think the underlying philosophy of inside out leadership, human centric leadership, truth telling, but maybe truth telling from the other side. Like, how do I speak truth to power and the obligation to dissent? Those are all concepts that are widely applicable and very important, even for somebody entering the workforce. So I've played a very central role in partner learning and firm learning within McKinsey as well for a long period of time. I used to meet every single person coming into the New York office. And my advice always used to be ask a lot of questions and learn how to exercise the obligation to dissent, the obligation to engage. Part of what I've been doing through the book is making sure the messages are resonating not just with senior audiences, but also with like people earlier in the workforce. And then over time, depending on how much time I have, I want to take this to universities and engage with people even in schools. Let's see how far I'm able to go down that process.
No, I love that. I think the people really internalizing sort of these lessons and being able to speak with the common language and so on will have a huge impact. One of the things I noticed is, if you look at some of the organizational research that companies do, level of disengagement by employees is very high. It's been high like forever. Generally, it feels like the equilibrium is sort of in for organizational health is on average like pretty low. On average, there's not a high level of trust in like leaders and managers. I'm curious why that may be the case and how we might systematically improve organizations that doesn't rely on a few leaders who are trying really hard to champion this, but actually the system itself does not incentivize the right behaviors.
Great question, or set of questions in there. Maybe enough for us to write a book together.
Yeah, it's true. I think that is probably the secret to like unlocking it at scale.
It is, it is. And I think you're absolutely right that engagement, trust are low. And in fact, our research, just to reinforce that point, 75% of employees find that the most stressful period in their workday is the time with their manager. And by the way, back to what we talked about, right, with all the geopolitics and the technology disruptions, I am not surprised why the mental health challenges are quite high in the workplace. And a lot has been written about that. So that's what you see playing out. And that's why the factors that you're talking about are true. And in fact, this goes back to this idea of human-centric leadership that we've been talking about. And part of our hope through this book and through the ideas that we've been talking to our clients and other people in the world is to help leaders understand their people better, listen more deeply, of course, be authentic and consistent with their purpose, but help match the organization's purpose with what gives meaning and the individual's purpose. We have good research that shows what are the sources of meaning to any individual that can come from my own development or how I'm working in a team, how I'm helping a customer, how I'm helping society more broadly or help build an institution more broadly. So the art and science for leaders is to connect what they want to get done and what the institution is trying to get done with what gives purpose to every single individual. And if they can do that successfully, then they can unleash huge potential of their people and huge performance as well, long term. All our, again, research shows that institutions that invest in people and unleash the potential of people can drive like 3-4 more X the returns to investors. So this is actually the smart long-term strategy. The challenge is more because of all the disruptions and all the short-term pressures. How do I keep the focus on both the short-term and the long-term? And as I'm doing some of these moves in the short-term, how do I do that in a caring way, in an empathetic way, so that I bring people along in the journey? I show people why I'm doing what I'm doing. What's my pathway for long-term success? That's the key to retain engagement and retain trust that you're talking about. But it's not easy, and it's definitely not easy to do at scale. That's where I think leaders and organizations need to spend their time and invest their energy so that they can bring everybody along in a change process.
Talking about sort of some of these topics, maybe typical barriers you've seen people talk about as they try to apply this sort of thinking to their organization, and any recommendations you might have to other leaders who want to bring this kind of thinking to their teams?
Yeah, I go back to, a quote by the poet Rumi, who said, right, when I was young and, I thought I could change the world. As I grew older and wiser, I realized that the only person that I can change is myself. My advice would be to start with yourself. Who are you? What is your purpose? Why are you doing what you're doing? What gives you energy? And use that to then frame what are the problems you want the team to solve, co-create solutions with the team, and use that then to drive change at scale in a way that unleashes potential of people and of the institution. That would be my advice, which goes back to the core concept of the book.
I love that. Yeah, start by looking inward. That's a great sort of simple message to, if you take away one thing, that's sort of like a good place to land. I really appreciated reading through the book as someone who's trying to lead an organization. Definitely helped me reflect on things that I want to work on and to get better myself. Thanks for bringing these ideas to life. And I look forward to hearing more like how these ideas get refined over time as you talk to more leaders and the next book that you might write after.
Thank you, Vince. Look forward to continuing our dialogue and learning from each other. Thank you.
Thank you.